Dave Wilkerson, when he was driving from Dallas, he was living in New York at this time. He was driving from Dallas, we believe, to somewhere else, maybe, I don't know, Louisiana or someplace. As he was coming along I-20, it's about to intersect with 110. The Lord told him to stop and get out of his car. So he did, and it was just that turnoff. And he looked around and he saw nothing. And the Lord said to him, "You will have a place here one day." So he put it in his journal, and then he drove on, and then he forgot about it. But years later, after David had been flying quite regularly every month from New York to California, and he hated flying. Matter of fact, one of his famous scriptures was, "Lo, I am with you always." And he even tried to enroll as to learn how to fly. And the guy told him, "There's some people who should never be flying, and you're one of them." He had to travel with his bus over the entire country. So he wanted to find a place that would make those trips shorter. Otherwise, it took like a whole week to get from one place to another. So Dave Patterson, who was his crusade manager and did a lot of the crusade study and stuff for Dave, said he would research it. And so he was looking around. So what David was looking for was a property that would be more in the center of America. And David came up with this. He said, there is a place right in the middle of Texas. He said, I've checked with the military, it's one of the 5 areas in the United States that would be safest if a city, a major city, had an atomic attack. If a bomb was set off in Dallas, they said the way the winds blow, the way everything else is, it would not go as far as here. And it's over one of the largest water tables in the United States. And David at that time was really concerned about America falling. And so he was looking for a place he could move family, he could start a farm like he had with the Pennsylvania Farms for Teen Challenge. And so when David showed him this property that's connected now to the church is what came up. And so he moved here. He moved his whole family down. His mother came down here. And so this became the staging ground for all of their things. It's a place they could grow their own food. They had their own cows. There were a few horses for a brief short time. They were even thinking of bringing kids from New York and putting them in here. But it was David's vision to start a community that would be a safe community. They put their own water in, they put their own electricity, did all these other things. So that's the back of David's. Then Tony Salerno, who started Agape Force, at that time they started in Reedley, California, is where the first awakening broke out. Then they moved ultimately from there to Sebastopol. And Sebastopol, a church had been given Charlie Schultz's old property. Charlie had moved into Santa Rosa and he'd rebuilt a skating rink and moved there. But the old house that he grew up in, where you can still see the pyramid-shaped kennels for his dog Scooter, which became, you can see all the Peanuts characters, a baseball diamond and all of that there. That property was about 20-something acres. It had a miniature golf course on it. But when he sold it, he was looking actually to give it away as a charity, as a tax write-off. And he gave it to a church, but nobody could take care of a property that large. So when Tony had done some meetings and stuff in that area, in Santa Rosa, and we helped start a ministry there called Genesis. And people like Bill Johnson were some of the first students in that thing. So we actually moved, the whole of Agape Force was moved from where they were briefly in Fresno, sort of at Reedley, California, all the way up to Santa Rosa. But then even that became too much a problem if you were traveling across the country, like David Wilkerson had. To go again, to have a team go all the way up to New York would take a week. So he was looking for a similar sort of place It was in the middle of the country that could do those things. Buddy Hicks, Dr. Buddy Hicks, was at that time part of Agape Force, doing a lot of training. Marvelous man. He was a friend also of David's, a young friend of David's. And he called Dave and he said, do you know any properties? Because often people would give Teen Challenge properties. They said, if you'd like to use this for Teen Challenge, we'd like to make it available to you. So David said, well, I know 2 in Arkansas. And he said, there's actually one right next door to where I am that's also just come up. And that's owned by Zales, the jewelry family. And they have that property. And he said, that's another possibility. Then after he hung up, he called back 5 minutes later. He said, forget Arkansas, come up and see this. So I flew up with Tony and with one other of the key guys, and we rode through this property where the church is and the ranch beside it. And it was just basically forest and some spaces in the thing. There was no buildings, there was nothing else here. And that is where Tony felt this is the place we need to put Agape Force. So we lived in the Garden Valley golf course apartments. Buddy and his wife and Faye and I and Tony lived in those things until the property that, this section of that property that this church was built on was built. It only took 2 weeks to build it. And it cost less than it would cost to write up the plans for anything they would have done in Sebastopol. So while we were in New Zealand, the entire Agape Force moved from Sebastopol to Texas. And that's where we spent Christmas in a little house in the prairie, which is in the middle of that field that is now part of Mercy Ships. So this church, the original building of it, metal building, the whole foundations were laid in 2 weeks, and the whole building up went around. And it was designed for 2 things. One is a warehouse for Agape Force material, and for a temporary staying place for the kids who were part of that. And that is why it has that sort of warehouse-looking shape. And later, when they actually moved most of the stuff they were working on to the ranch, what was on that ranch and what they built was quite amazing. You can still see it today. They built a gym there, big enough to hold major meetings in. They built the cafeteria there. They built a motel to put in visiting speakers. They put in electrical and water systems and sewerage systems, all that were within that structure. And right next door to Dave's, and later a bookstore, a laundry, the Grublets hideaway, all of these areas that are now part of Mercy Ships. So many of the visiting speakers like George Ver and others would come. They saw what was being done with children and teenagers, and it really helped them. Some of them moved from being very acidic in their presentation of the gospel to being very passionate and much more loving to the people they worked with. And Ver was one of those great. He came into their bookstore afraid to look, thinking it's going to be full of junk. And he was so impressed by the books there that he came to one of the first Agape Force children's stuff. So the work here that became the church then became a sort of a ministry ground. And out of that, a bunch of other things happened. The first key one that fed a lot of people who now come to this church was a thing called DTI. It was the first discipleship training institute that had ever been made. And the idea was not to use long-term just Bible teachers, but actual people who were still actively involved in missions or in evangelism or street ministries of some sort to come in and share on a very short-term basis. And they called it a DTI. And it later became the model for the YWAM DTS. And then because Dennis Lindsay, the son of the Christ for the Nations team, was part of YWAM, saw that thing, saw the DTI, saw the YWAM DTS, applied it in Christ for the Nations, and that became their basis for ministry. So with Agape Force in this area, over 26 major forms of ministries were launched during that generational ministry, involving some 2,000 young people at the height of who had been touched, including evangelistic stage shows, Ginger Book Fair, that was the clown, school to reach children, Salvation Army model traveling ministry teams, and then singing groups began like Jim and Dee Patton, is still here, Silverwind. The gym and the church became a place for local ministry outreaches like hay bale, hootenanny things that they used to have in the church that is here now. And it became a center for other youth ministries in the area. And then YWAM, which had actually bought property out near the Tyler Airport, they also began to bring people in the area. And now, of course, they own the property where David was. And Mercy Ships owns the property where Agape Force used to be. But this church has stayed in the same area, not made distinct from the rest of the properties through all of those times. So it's been here a long time. It was all over the country, California, New York. But David, this was going to be more at the most. He actually thought this would be a good base for me to work out of. David Wilkerson did? Yeah, but one of his ideas was that maybe some of the guys who were in New York that got saved could be moved down here to take them right out of the big cities. You know, they'd be out with cows and things here, and it never really worked out. It was too long a trip, a couple of 1,000 miles to get down here. But Teen Challenge itself never began here, never staged here. It was a home place for David, and part of the idea he had is for a training school. But that stayed up in Pittsburgh and some of the other areas that he had. But no, it never was. So all these other ministries that came in there, when Agape Force finally moved out of here after a whole generation, generation's 25 years, and Agape Force was a generational ministry, only lasted about as long. It's geared for teenagers, college students, and then when they all grow up, then it changes to something else. So when it moved its center back to the West Coast, the ranch was sold to a Baptist Bible college that only had a very short time, and it was through our Young Life leaders' contact in this same area, still here. And then it was passed on briefly to a trauma center, not a Christian work, and then it closed for a block of time, and then Mercy Ships finally came back in and got to buy it, and that's their base now. So the church remained the same place, it became distinct from the ranch, and the pastors assumed responsibility for CCF from the original elders, some of them that you put on that list. L.B. Pearson, all the way through to Tracy, Don Crum, and through to Tracy, who was the last pastor before Dave Hickey came. And then Last Days that your connection is with, you know all about that, but Keith and Melody got saved, remember, in California, and their move up to here came because they kept growing. Well, they kept having to buy houses because nobody would put kids up where they were. I think they bought 3 houses before they realized we're going to keep doing this, we'll have to buy half of California. And knowing out, they knew about what was happening up here because every time we flew home to New Zealand, we always went through LA. And Keith would always ask us to come a couple of days early and spend time in their house doing a home group thing with their kids. So we shared a bit about Agape Force. I met Keith in a Fellowship of Christian Contemporary Ministries thing that in those days became sort of part street ministries and part almost a trial ground for music producers that wanted to see whether or not they wanted to carry somebody's music. So Keith, he'd just got saved, he'd just started doing stuff, and Billy Ray Hearn heard about him, and so Keith was invited to sing for the week that we did there, and I was invited to preach on revival, which I did, and the Lord showed up, and we did have a little awakening there. But I was up with Keith all night, he'd come alive at about 1 or 2 in the morning and be there till 6 in the morning talking about revival. So because of that connection, Keith decided to move the entire work from where they were, and was getting more expensive, to here. And that's how Last Days began. So they got a similar sized property to both Dave's place and then to Agape Force. And then the things that came out of that, which you'd know all about, was the Last Days Garden Valley Artist Retreat. And that started a few years earlier with, we actually had it as in Dallas, as we just rented a hotel for a couple of days and people flew in, different leaders, but then Keith took over the responsibility of running it and became they had up to 300 visiting speakers, singers, stuff came. That was a very, very wonderful time. But plus, during that time, that's when Keith's moved there, and then Dave Wilkerson was there, and the Agape Force was there, and a bunch of different... Leonard Ravenhill moved in. And then finally his older son, Paul, and then David, who became a more permanent... so each of these works are all revival-hearted or mission-based or evangelist. That's what all of these different works were. So the church became a gathering ground for quite a bunch of different ministries, and the things they had in common were that they were all missions, or all interested in evangelism and in a holy life and prayer times and all of these things. So it became, I call it another Wheaton. It was like a gathering place for a bunch of different communities, each who had their own unique things. And that's kind of the roots of CCF. The music groups that came quite well known. We had Dallas Home and Praise, of course, with Dave Wilkerson for many years. And Praise was his band. And Barry McGuire was here briefly. Second chapter of Acts was here. Buck and Annie stayed out a place where it's now Teen Mania, where they staged their filming stuff like we're doing here in their old music studio there. And a whole bunch of different people. Chuck Gerard came, Jimmy and Carol Owens came to that thing. Petra was there, the different guys that were in that thing. Steve Green drove 2,000 miles to get there. So Bill Gaither was there briefly. Andre Crouch was there. There's a whole string of amazing people that came together and learned and loved each other, almost like a Christian Inklings, which is very rarely done. But in England, when C.S. Lewis and Tolkien and Dorothy Sayers and some of these others got together once a month or so and got to share different things, that's what the Garden Valley Artist Retreat became like, a wonderful way to simply share your hearts, not a time where everybody could show off their latest and coolest songs and stuff, but just worship together and love each other together and share, weep together if necessary. And a number of different people came in to that. John Dawson did a lot of things for YWAM. Linda Cope. There's just different people came and shared. Albie shared a little bit. Different pastors came. And now, of course, Teen Mania, seeking a place less expensive than the previous temporary school things they had first in Oklahoma and then in Florida. When Last Days, when Keith died, and then Last Days kind of lost their main staff people. You were there in the base of that. And Teen Mania finally bought the property and then added a whole bunch of things that were not there when Keith had it. Keith's work was ex-hippie. Ron's work was Oral Roberts, university. So it was a lot classier looking and stuff, and it still runs there, but that's the base. So that's why I put, since those early days, the Garden Valley community has involved many other ministries and made it in some ways another Wheaton. So that's my take on some of the things.
Albie?
Yeah. He was a famous baseball player. He did sing a bit, I've got one of his albums. Oh. But he wasn't a well-known musician. He was known because of his awesome baseball records. He was, I think he was Angels or something, yeah. So his work here was long. It wasn't like just a couple of months. He stayed here. His family were here. His children were here in this area. But Albie was always a mystical ministry. He was very supernatural. His children saw angels and all kinds of things. It was a different kind of work than the majority of what people from this area would have ever heard of. He came occasionally when they had a reunion thing, and he also spoke in the YWAM, what was it, the Go Fest that came a couple of times. So I think his daughters now live in Hawaii and stuff.
One of them in Arkansas.
Yeah, that's right, yeah. So, yeah, Albie was really cool. He was a...
You want to mention about Go Fest a little more?
Yeah, Go Fest is a work that YWAM opened on the property that they bought. They had quite a large, enough to hold at least 2,000 or 3,000 people. And it was kind of a bowl-shaped area. They built a stage there. They put a place for the sound engineering and stuff in it. And they could hold at least 2,000 people sitting on the grass. And there's no fire. There were fire ants, but not that many that time. So for quite a while, they had some quite large meetings. It became a hard place to stay in because you couldn't just put a tent somewhere down. People didn't realize how scary it was in East Texas with tarantula spiders and, all of these other snakes. And so you didn't kind of encourage, it wasn't like Pittsburgh or like Pennsylvania or more like Pennsylvania or Florida where it's kind of, you can just pitch your tent anywhere. So it became a place where it's like more like a one-night thing, or at the most 2 nights, rather than a whole 3 or 4 day conference. And but they did have some great speakers. Of course, our whole structure in this area, David had a very core place to play, and so did Don Crum have a place to play in that. And that very strange night when they had a major singing group down, and David felt like he had a group singing from hell, came through prophesying through the deal. But the other wild thing is what happened with Don Crum, who was getting ready for the Sunday service. This was Saturday night, and he had friends that came from India, and he was in the church here, and he used to, if he got tired, he'd just fall asleep on the couch where his office was. Just lock the door and fall asleep. And the early morning, I think it was, the secretary had come back into the church. There was this terrible racket inside the thing. So he woke up, and it was still quite dark. And the whole inside of his thing was like the shelves had been broken down and things had fallen all over the place. And so the secretary said, "Pastor Don, are you all right?" And he opened the door and he's looking, and there's all of this around. He had no idea that happened. But we think it was. They'd bought the folks had gone to India, had brought back quite a beautiful sculpture of an elephant that was being attacked by a tiger. The tiger was on the back of the elephant. And it was actually an idol. And it was put right up in his... it's just a beautiful looking little statue over there, and we think it was a demonic manifestation took place. Same time as what happened David said he saw demons coming off the stage. I think he did, but I don't think they came from the group. I think they came from a link. And it was in this church. So there's all these wild things. Don was, remember, the pastor that went out and he cut down that. Did you remember the story of that? Oh, this is trippy. The place where Don was, in this, because he'd go on these mission trips, there is a sacred place that was a demonic place. They say that people taken to that area would die. So he took a power saw and he cut down this tree, which is like 1,000 years old. He cut it down, and it was worse than that, and it bled. It had human-looking blood came out of that tree. And he cut it up into planks, and he built a church out of it. So that was Don. He was a...
That was in Nigeria?
I can't remember where it was, but it was some nation where this was a major deal. And he just... And he cut it down, and there were actual pictures. He probably still has them somewhere. He took photos of the blood that was coming out of this tree. But in an hour or two, it vanished. It was one of the trippiest things. But then Don, he was pastoring here for a while, and we saw he constantly had in his heart missions and going out, and then eventually got the job he had for quite a few years working for the government. Yeah. So all of this church has had some amazing things happen to it or around it or with the... Tracy was an amazing addition to this church as a pastor. He came in as an architect, and he's from Potato State, Idaho sort of place, and he helped design some of the changes. Remember, it was done as a warehouse first. He began to turn it into a real-looking church building. And my office was in one of these Sunday school rooms, and then it became too large for the room. So Tracy took one of the outlying things that Agape Force had used first as a school for little kids, and later as a food supply thing for the region. And I needed a place to put my office, so he moved it from the Sunday school room, which had got too big for that, out to this thing there. And then the church grew, and they needed a room for their high school. So we had about 80 kids from both YWAM and a few from CCF that moved all of my library, which was about 10 or 12,000 books, in about an hour and a half into that trailer that we'd bought from Safeway. It was a refrigerated trailer and was pretty huge, and it had not only the back that went up, it used to carry sweet potatoes. So we cleaned it out and kind of lined it, and then some friends from both Prairie Creek and from here helped rebuild new shelves inside it. And that group of 80 kids made a human chain and carried the library out from there into that. So I had a full library running for 2 years until we found another place to put it, which is now over in the YWAM property. And that whole house, it became an office, it became the Revival Library.
The chemist, right?
Two key areas. When I got saved, which is I was 17, in high school still, but in the last 3 months, I got my university entrance and scholarship, and all that was ready to go. And then I found you didn't have to leave. There was no rule that said you have to leave. You could actually stay another year. So I asked my dad, who had got saved the same day as me, if I could come back for another year, and we saw a tenth of the school give their lives to the Lord there. That's what started my ministry. I worked for a while with Youth for Christ. I became a director of the Auckland Youth for Christ, and then that job closed, and Joy Dawson called me, and she said, a man has come to visit our home And I feel it would be in the Lord if you met this man. And so I'm looking at my schedule, which is empty for the rest of my life. And I said, I do have some time. So I went over there, and all I had left was the book, which is not finished. And it was Youth Aflame. It was typed out, but it had never been printed yet. And the guy was Loren Cunningham in his first trip around the world. He had never been any other country except Mexico. And so this was his first trip after seeing this vision of waves breaking against the shores, and then they all became young people, which was the heart of how YWAM's vision began. So I went over to see Loren and spent the whole day with him. And Joy slipped some food under the door at lunchtime, and by about 6 o'clock, I had my eyes full of tears. I thought, here's a guy who's saying the same things I've found about revival. He's already starting doing this thing, and I've never seen anybody who said that or did those same sort of things. So I asked him, it was about 6 o'clock, I said, Loren, what are you going to do to train these kids? I'm thinking about the discipling of people. And he said, I'm supposed to do a book of some kind for it, but he said, I haven't had time to do it. And I said to him shyly, I have a book. And I pulled out of my paper bag Youth Aflame, which had never been printed yet. And he opened it, and he was just flicking through, starting to see where it started. And he said, what do you call this? And I said, I call it Youth Aflame. And he said, he got really quiet. He said, that's the name God gave me for the book. So when he was going through it, he said, what are you going to do with it? I said, I've got about 300 kids here I'm going to train with this. I'm going to Gestetner it off. And then he said, oh no, we need this. We need thousands of these, tens of thousands. Loren with his global vision, he said, you come to the US and I'll help you print it. So I came back to the US. I visited a couple of times with Youth for Christ and the small teen team thing. But my visit back here, I didn't preach for a year. And Loren arrived again. And I just started finishing laying out on an IBM Selectric. No, it's an executive. And it made a proper layout looking thing. And learned how to print. To use proper printing stuff. So he arrives, we buy a new AB Dick 360, I printed it, I bought a bunch of kids that had got saved in a revival that broke out in Corona, California, which used to be the acid capital of California, and about 40 kids from that awakening came out to the church we were living in at the time. And the manual was all laid out on the chairs of the church, and they put them all together with those little funny things that do this, the clips that hold the whole thing together. The punched out stuff we used as confetti in our wedding, and I finished 2,000 of those just before Christmas. And then Loren came back again, and he was speaking in San Diego in a large Assembly of God youth convention. And he had 4 meetings in that convention. And he asked me to do one. I had not spoken in a whole year working on this thing. So for Christmas and for that convention, I gave one to David Wilkerson and one for his kids. And I gave one to Loren. And I said, this is my present to Jesus for Christmas. And I preached for the first time in that convention. And a guy came up, his name was Paul Bruton, and he was over the Assemblies of God. He was DCAP, District CA President of Southern California. And he said, would you be willing to speak in some of the camps that we have in the San Bernardino Mountains? Each one had about 500 kids. Andre and the disciples, the first ones, were going to be there, and other. So I started preaching again. So I'm here. Agape Force, Tony Salerno got saved in the meetings we had. Agape Force began. We had concentration camps, they were called in those days. It became war weeks, which became training. So I am now living in the area where David Wilkerson, that I'd worked for when Leonard Ravenhill was up there in New York, in Bedford-Stuyvesant area. So all the people that helped train me and became inspirations to my life, I'm living where they lived. Agape Force moved here beside David. I've filled in for David a couple of times when he didn't do stuff, and then Agape Force adopted me, and then YWAM adopted me when Agape Force moved back to California again. So to this day, still working with Tony and Kathy Salerno, still hanging out sometimes with Lauren and with YWAM, still. David's gone now, Gwen's gone, and a lot of the ones that we put into the Revival Study Bible that I've known have gone. Leonard's gone, Derek Prince is gone, Campbell McAlpine's gone. There's a whole bunch of men and women that have passed now. But it's nice to still be here after having died once to see what God's going to do with another generation. So this is my 5th generation of teenagers and college students. And he wrote a letter, and he said, I just want to come out there and meet Charles Finney and Keith Green and A.W. Tozer. And I didn't have the heart to tell them they're all dead. But people didn't know. They didn't know Keith had died. A lot of people still don't know Keith died. They go, who is this guy? What awesome, you know that thing?
Yeah, yeah.
So is this shot?
It's rolling now.
Okay, Leonard was probably the last of the living legends of the revivalists. And in his very early days, he and a small team of guys pushed a wheelbarrow around places with an Oxford Dictionary in it, and they memorized every single day 2 pages of the Oxford Dictionary and preached on the streets for the longest time. He was also A.W. Tozer's close friend. Tozer was the pastor, Leonard was the evangelist and the revivalist. And both of them were nearly killed when they were in a hotel together, and an upper story, second story up, and somebody set fire to the stairs and everything else to kill them. And they jumped, both of them jumped out of the window. Tozer hurt something, but Leonard damaged his back, and that's why he became such a man of prayer. Like Catherine Booth had spinal scoliosis and never had a pain-free day in her life. Leonard didn't sleep very long, but he prayed an awful lot. But he became, in his little book, Why Revival Tarries, became the book. You'd see any kid that ever came from Bible college had it under his arm when he went out to preach, because it became a simple, powerful way of preaching the gospel with a revival-hearted message. So when Leonard moved up here, at the invitation of both Keith, and then he knew David Wilkerson and others, he thought it was a great place to come, and that's actually where he died. He's buried here. But he wanted to spend the years of his life, the last years of his life, sharing with other young people about revival. And his oldest son, Paul, was very much like his dad in many ways, but his heart was really in Latin America. So when Len died, Martha, his wife, moved out, died there, in that area with them. But David he was best man in our wedding. He became a close friend over the years. And for quite a few years, David lived here, went to the church here, and then moved back to Arkansas, where some of his friends from Bethany, where he originally went through Bible college. David was also part of YWAM in the early days. He was one of the very first teams that came to New Zealand, where we first met him. He was also connected with Teen Challenge in New York, where I spent an entire summer there in Bedford-Stuyvesant area. So all of these connections with YWAM, with David, with Leonard, with all of these things, were friends and people that I used as mentors. I learned so much from them. For instance, Leonard said to me, before you die, he said, you need to write a book about God, just about what he's like. And it'd be better for you to spend a whole chunk of your time just writing that one book than anything else you can do. So Nature and Character of God came out of that. And that did take 18 years, about 14 years to finish. But I wanted Leonard to be proud of me. You know, I have pictures of him when we were down in Sebastopol. He'd visit sometimes and come out and hang with us. And I never heard Leonard ever preach a sermon less than an hour and a half. And the wildest thing about him is that, and I have it in the revival, in the book Revival, Leonard was in a city where he'd preached, and he had a night off, and he got a call from one of the great Pentecostal revivalists of his day, and that's William Branham. And Branham called him in his hotel. You know, nobody knew where he was. And Branham said, look, I've got a meeting tonight, and I'm really tired. I can hardly... He said, I need somebody to preach. Could you come and preach for me? You know, he said, I'll pray for the sick afterwards because they're all coming. So Leonard went along, you know. He went along, and he preached for his hour-and-a-half message on holiness, and while Branham just sat there, you know, with him on stage, and then Branham got up to pray for people, and then a whole line of people that wanted prayer came up. Branham had one of those big microphones that looked like the old RCA ones there, and he would just tell people where they were from, never saw them before in their life. You're from so-and-so, your problem is you have this. And then some of them are crying in the deal, and then occasionally he would move the mic away, and then he would just talk to them. So right at the start of it, here's Lenny sitting on the stage, and right at the start of it, he said this busty blonde came, you know, and she was talking about something, and Branham said, the Lord will heal you when you stop your immorality. And, you know, that sort of shocked her. And a guy immediately behind her who heard, he didn't say this publicly, he said it moving the mic away. He said, I resent that, I'm her husband. And Branham got really quiet. Again, no microphone. He said, and God will heal you when you stop running around with your secretary. And then he took the mic back and he preached a half-hour message. He said, some of you think you can get away from God. You think that you can just come and ask him to do things. God will reveal anything in your life that stops you from change. See? And he said then when he finished, the whole line had gone. They all left the stage. So that was Len's one visit with Branham.
Wow.
So he's an amazing man. And very scary when you hear him preach, very loving when you knew him. Funny, really, quite funny. But not a funny guy. A seriously man who would lay his life down for the Lord. And his oldest son is like him, and the humor, the bon mots, the little short, too much organizing in the supper room, not enough agonizing in the upper room, those little short bon mot things. But David is the researcher guy, you know, the one that did all the writing and the work, and they're all contributors in the study Bible. Faye and I thought we were going to go to the Philippines as missionaries. So when we got the Youth Aflame done, which was in the US, remember, Lauren had asked us to, when that was, we're not talking about my 2,000 copies, but one of the guys who worked for Xerox, who was a YWAM leader, Rod Gearhart, he had some money from stocks with Xerox, and he was the one that underwrote the first printing of Youth Aflame in Hong Kong, 10,000 copy thing. That was used a lot in YWAM and Teen Challenge and other places. So we thought when the 2,000 things were done that we would move to the Philippines, because I had 3 invitations, one from Rudy Esperanza, who was the head of the Assemblies of God in the Philippines, one from a guy called Greg Tingson, who was over the Chi Alpha section of the Assemblies of God in the Philippines, and a third was an American missionary who got saved in the Jesus movement, was also there. All three had invited us to come and work out of the Philippines in evangelism. And then the Jesus movement broke out. And when the manual first got released, so many people started asking for it, and so much ministry came out of that, that I sent 300 copies to the Philippines and print, just said, do whatever you want with them, translate them if you like. But so I never got to the Philippines. I never got there at all. Rudy died. Greg Tingson moved somewhere, and I never saw that American missionary, and I never heard from him until 2 or 3 years ago. And he told us what happened. But about 10 or 15 years ago, in the Philippines, they had a convention called Convergence, where the 3 streams of the Jesus movement, the equivalent of Vineyard and, like Maranatha and all these 3 major movements, all came together for the first time. And when I came there, when I got off the plane and arrived, there were others, friends there. There was, George Otis Jr., and there was Lou, from, the part of the call and all these other things. It was a long table with about 40 people in it. And they all started singing, "It Only Takes a Spark to Set a Fire Going." And they were all 3 generations of Jesus movement from 3 different streams. And they've started over, I think it's 130,000 churches. And all of them used Youth Aflame as their base. And I didn't even know. I never even heard anything. Occasionally I'd have a little letter from somebody. I got sent a copy of them marching in the street, and Marxists threw a hand grenade into the middle of them, and it didn't go off. And they put that on the cover of their first Filipino Youth Aflame, and I've still got that sitting in the Revival Library. But it shows me that if you take God's word seriously and put it in a way that the young can use it, the young will not rule nations now, but they will in 10 years. And all I tell people is, youth are not the future of the church, they are the church. And if you don't reach them now, you haven't lost some future church, you've lost the church. And that's why I'm incorrigibly still working with kids. People ask, why do you still do that? Why don't you, they talk about the Peter principle, being promoted to your level of incompetence, and, and I tell them, the reason I'm working with kids is because God gave me more than 1 brain cell. And I've seen what he does. They're not the ones with the money and the fame and all these other things, but they will be. And if you look at the Olympic Games and you see exactly how old is the average person here, you'll see why God invariably over history has worked with kids. There's some embarrassing things here though for some people. There were a bunch of pastors, youth pastors, and they didn't know how to deal with these kids when they came back from these camps. They said, we don't even know how to talk, because we gave them stuff on forgiveness and repentance, and we gave them all kinds of basic, surrendering everything to God. We played tapes to them. David Wilkerson's The Making of a Man of God, and Joy Dawson's The Moving of the Ark, and all these scary things. And gave them away these books, True Discipleship, and, Sammy Morrison's story, Crossing the Switchblade. Those were all giveaways in these camps. And so these youth pastors didn't know how to handle them. They came back. They weren't like any other kids that they'd had before. It's a week-long camp. So they said, we don't even know how to talk to them. I said, we'll put on a special camp for you. We'll call it a counter-revolutionary camp. But you guys come and we'll give you what we're going to give to the kids. Give them the same program. A whole bunch of them got right with God. They were pastors and youth pastors and got saved. One of them was Bob Weiner, who started Maranatha Ministries. Many of them just came. We were all sucking carpet. It was one of those major deals of stuff. But when Bob got saved, and he's already a youth pastor, he did a lot of stuff. He got right with God. went back to his hometown, started some ministry eventually with high schools, and then broke out, became college, and then it became Maranatha Ministries. The reason I'm giving you all of this, and you can't put this into, you can tape it if you like, but don't put it on a public deal. Maranatha, after a bunch of years of very powerful stuff, broke up. And Bob and his wife started their own ministry, and they're still doing massive stuff overseas. They're doing it in Russia, they're doing it in China, they're doing it in other places. But their work, Maranatha Ministries, as a college ministry, became a church ministry. They weren't necessarily connected with colleges at all. And they became what is now called Every Nation. And it was for a while the same name as Morning Star, Rick Joyner's work, so that people wouldn't confuse the two. And that work started with, not with Bob, but it started with Larry Tomczak and C.J. Mahaney and Cheyenne. And that began as a little revival that broke out in Washington, D.C., where about 2,000 kids got saved. It's quite an amazing deal. So that became People of Destiny. For a bunch of years, there's some very powerful churches. But the mother church was right by R.C. Sproul's seminary. And a bunch of R.C. Sproul's Reformed guys came into People of Destiny. They loved the worship, loved everything else, became leaders in it. And eventually, People of Destiny scrubbed the name and became something else. Grace something like that. They became a full Reformed church. And that is when Cheyenne, who had won 400 people, had joined the church he started when he was in Fuller. He's still a kid in Fuller Seminary. He had got a Yonggi Cho Church Growth Award. But his desire was to see missions and evangelism in Asians, particularly, not only the Philippines and other countries, but there in LA. And so he gave, the church cut off missions. They stopped doing missions. And so he gave the church to his elders and started again that prayer meeting with Lou and some of the others. And that is when that 24-hour, 24/7 prayer meeting began. And that is what God spoke to them about putting on the call. And that was one of the scariest things they ever had to do in their lives. But the thing that went back to the original church is this. That church became Every Nation eventually. It was affected by the guy Rice Brooks, who had got saved under Bob's work. They combined those church plants that they had into a new kind of work, and it became Reform. So a couple of the other guys had to leave. Here is Chase had a whole bunch of people coming from these other churches because they could no longer speak in tongues and other weird things.
Oh, yeah.
So his work grew massively. He's over 300 churches or something now in that work. The reason I'm telling you all of those weird things is that Rice Brooks, who got saved in Maranatha, became a Reformed guy, moved in with a guy from the Philippines. There's a wonderful bunch of churches there. He's strongly Reformed. And they're all in Nashville, Tennessee now. And 2 days ago, I haven't talked to Rice since those very early days, because I'm like a different world than a Reformed world. I'm early church fathers, not that at all. See? So here's Rice. He's just done a seminar this last Saturday with the #1 textual analysis guy who is the major guy to deal with textual criticism in the world. And so Rice has met him. He teaches in Dallas Theological, okay? And Rice just had a seminar with him and has become a friend. When he finishes the seminar, the guy says to him, "Do you know Winkie Pratney?" And he goes, "Yes." See? He says, "When I was 16, I went to this meeting and he counseled me for 2 hours and I got saved."
Wow.
And that freaked Bryce out. So he called me and he said, "I've got this guy," and he told me the story of him. And I talked to him 2 days ago on the phone. He called me on his way back to Dallas.
That's so cool.
But I'll see Rice again, and I'm going to see this guy who started the stuff in the Philippines. Remember, they're all reformers now.
Interesting.